Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Ukrainian Crisis Media Center starts second where everybody watching us online and who has come to our briefing here. Our briefing is devoted to discussion about the achievements in gender equality policy within 30 years of Ukrainian independence. Thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss the issue, and we're going to discuss the achievements in the female movement and to discuss the major challenges and victories within this period, and perhaps we'll discuss the possibilities for the future. Having first discussed the times past, let me introduce my participants. To my left, I have Ms. Larysa Kobelyanska, Chairman of the Expert Council in Gender Issues. Then Ms. Kateryna Levchenko, the Ombudsman in Gender Policy. Then Iryna Slavinska, one of the co-founders of charity association Women Can, and we have also Iryna Suslova on Skype connection with us, and our project is carried out within the project on the framework of the International Media Development Institute. As for me, I'm Iryna Slavinska. I'm a journalist, and I'm a colleague of those people who contribute to the female and equality and gender equality, female rights and gender equality in Ukraine, discussing the issue. It would be perhaps the sign of sexism to state that both genders equally contributed to the development of this country. I believe that this joke could be called a traditional joke for all our gender equality associations. I believe that we should discuss this topic in the context of our heritage, in the context of our previous experiences, discussing the traditional values of the female movements in Ukraine in the past. Kateryna, the floor is yours. Thank you. Of course, the women's movement in Ukraine is not the beginning of a new days of our days, but we can trace it back to the 20th century and even to the 19th century, perhaps even to earlier periods, where we can see development of various female groups which contributed to spiritual, to political and social of life of Ukraine. This is related to a distinctive feature of Ukrainian ethnicity in the past. Larysa, Today we have here those people who could be called the mothers, founders of Ukrainian female movement in late 20th century, and I would like to thank to these ladies. Because today we clearly understand that there is a big difference between today's situation and environment for the policy decisions in gender area, and and that was in the past. I believe that it's a good moment to discuss this the project which we carried out. It collected the stories of not very famous women, not like Larysa Ukrainka, who were very famous, but those almost unknown to broad public women. They contributed much to the development of gender equality movement in Ukraine. Larysa, thank you for this opportunity to participate in this discussion. Let me come closer to the 30th anniversary of Ukrainian independence and recollect something from the year 1991. Today, finding ourselves in the midst of nostalgic reminiscences, quite often we look at the documentaries from that period. We clearly remember, clearly see that Ukraine entered its period of independence with very vague, very uncertain vision about the things with which female organizations should be preoccupied with, and at that time. And due to this vague understanding of what we should do as women of independent Ukraine, we managed to create a wide spectrum of female organizations. Here we may recollect the Union of Ukrainian Women, the Association of Mothers of Soldiers. The first one, the Women's Union, was organized by Madame Orlek. The second was organized by those mothers whose sons were servicemen in Soviet troops in Afghanistan, and some other organizations united various professional women, so that wide spectrum, very colorful spectrum, and each color of that spectrum had passed through long history. They studied the history, they formulated the agenda of the most topical issues for Ukraine at that time. They offered some projects which coincided with the agenda of the United Nations and the agenda of other international organizations, thus bringing Ukraine to the community of global topics and global policies. Thus, Ukrainian women gradually came to the understanding of their societal mission. This brings us closer to the range of topics which we are going to discuss next about today. But before doing that, I will give the floor to Olena Suslova. Thank you for this opportunity. This is the important anniversary in our Soviet history. You may recollect that this is the anniversary of the unsuccessful coup d'etat, which happened in 1991 on this day. And in my opinion, in this day, we should recollect those who were very important at that time and who are almost forgotten today. I would like to recollect Ms. Oksana Meshko, who is almost unknown to today's people. She was born in 1905 and she actually died in early 1991, but her own principles, and she became herself a role model for us. I would like to recollect another person, Ms. Ludmila Smirnova, who was the international journalist. She was born in 1946, and at that time he made an attempt to play against the role model which was assigned to women at that time. She wrote a brilliant book about NATO, but the Moscow censors found out, military censors decided that a woman could not produce a meaningful book about military issues, and eventually she had published her book in Hungary under the male name, like Valentin Smirnov, and this emphasizes how difficult it was for women to do something at that time. These examples are big inspirations for us. Thank you very much. I would like to mention the names of those women who as you mentioned, there are women who are not often recollected into one. There are a lot of pictures in that book, and you almost cannot find women on those pictures, which today looks rather strange for us, but what impresses you most, that you see a lot of men in business suits and almost no female faces. So let us now recollect the challenges which women in 1991 faced. Larysa, could you add a couple of words on this topic?
Several days ago, I met Maria Vorlik, and she was deputy of Prime Minister of Ukraine. And for many years, she has been heading the Women's Union of Ukraine. And we spoke about contribution of women to adoption of constitution. In Nairobi, there was a world conference in 1985. And she headed governmental delegation, and she headed all delegations except the delegation to Beijing. And in Nairobi at the conference, the agenda was the requirement to introduce changes to national constitutions to provide equal participation for men and women and equality of rights for men and women was introduced. And the Constitutional Council adopted this point and introduced changes to Article 24. And this is one of many contributions of the women's movement. On the eve of adoption of constitution, a group was created of 11 women's organizations, and that was addressed to Ukrainian people and to the Verkhovna Rada and to the Constitutional Council concerning this point, that this should be provided for. And I would like to say that women, they fought for their rights. First, there were only suits of men, and now we have many colors of women's attire. And we see many women in governmental structures and in the parliament. One of the requirements was to increase the number of women in the bodies of power of all levels, and the fight for quotas that ended recently. Before the last elections, we got changes to the law on elections with fixed quota. So the first 4 convocations, we had 2% of women, and the next 4 convocations, this percentage was 4 to 8% of women. And these issues were raised by women to increase number of women in governmental structures that influence important decisions, that influence the life of society. This was supported by the low level that Ukraine had at that time. And the level of education of women was really high, and we were in the top 20 concerning education for women. And this was an important agenda. And women's unions in 1990s, these were really difficult years, and they dealt with many important social and humanitarian issues. There was help from diaspora to vulnerable groups, women and children. This help went through NGOs. And there were important processes closer to 2000 concerning constitutional changes in 1944. There was also a conference concerning women's issues, and the agenda was changed, and they focused more on gender policy, and there was a transformation from one side, and from the other, the focus was preserved concerning support of women's rights, and Ukraine participated actively in these processes. So I believe that this list is really extensive, and we'd like to continue our discussion, and we give the floor to Kateryna. Thank you. So in 1990s, there were many challenges, and now we see that there was contradictions in perception concerning women's rights and how the state should implement this policy. So what I'm speaking about is that before independence, the head of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, was speaking about changes and reforms in society, and there was a slogan that was supported by the whole country, by many countries, to provide women with traditional responsibilities after Soviet era, after destruction and poverty and overload and many problems, and many things were made at the expense of rural population and women. Collectivization and industrialization, they were done because many groups were sacrificed, and women get tripled load, and the slogan, people liked it, and everyone wanted to improve lives of women and to decrease the load on them. And this became the basis for discussive things. And they spoke about political leadership of women and also broadening of the economic opportunities and their participation in decision-making. And many people said that women need to have more time. They need more time for children, for family, for protection of motherhood. And there is opposition to gender quotas. We see also opposition of participation of women in many processes. And in 1990s, women's unions, they promoted the idea of women as homemakers. And the commission was created in 1994. Olena Gardakova was the head of it. This was the Commission for Protection of Women and the Families, and now we deal with one part of this issue concerning provision of rights and gender equality. And this was put to the forefront, and through the prism, they paid more attention to motherhood, and this policy was promoted through this patriarchal paradigm, and we should change it because it is painful for many structures now. Olena will join us, and we will provide her the floor. Thank you. I will speak about my experience. I will speak more about what problems we faced at the time. I got the idea of equal rights of men and women in February 1990. On the 24th, we've met with our union, and I was the head of the Kiev unit at that time in Chernivtsi. There was an assembly of one of Protestant churches, and they now actively promote gender issues, and we met in the park, and there were a lot of people, and we paid attention to this group and about the problems we faced at the time. We had many of them. Now analysts think about these problems, but we had simpler approach. We didn't have wonderful building where we could get united. And newly created organizations, they didn't have their own premises. Now we also have such a problem, but there are many hubs and open spaces where you can meet. Next point is information. Someone went to Nairobi, and others they only could see this city on the map. It was difficult to find any information. And I remember when I was sent a letter by the women's organization, and this was the they sent journals to me, and I made a pyramid of these journals in my one-room flat. And I found out a lot of interesting things in them, and there were a lot of problems with supporting identity, and we were trying to find this identity. We wanted to understand why we created these NGOs and these words of anthem of women's unions, that behind us are the nights and before us are bright days. And we had big problem. We lacked managerial skills. We didn't know how to form NGOs. The word training was unclear for us. It appeared later. And also one thing hindered the development of women's movement. Today we have this problem, but it is now different. This is high competitiveness. This is Soviet organizational culture. It didn't envisage pluralism of opinions or some differences. And in women's organizations and in political movements, we lacked this. And it did a lot of harm at the beginning. And this was a barrier for moving forward. And we should remember about this. There was a lot of enthusiasm, high motivation, and this helped us to move forward and overcome difficulties. And I remember clearly that Ukrainian Helsinki Union, and I was the member, they got the premise in Parizna Street, and this was a premise without proper conditions. And we invited our members, the members of our union. We addressed our Kievan office that maybe they would be able to provide a room for us. And we came there and we worked there. It was end of 1990, and they asked whether Levchenko was supported as the candidate for the president. And I asked them, how does it relate? And they said that Ukrainian Women's Union should promote this candidate. And for me, this was really impressive. This was a vulnerability. I'm an idealist to a large extent, but I understand that this is really difficult to be independent, to fight for your independence and to live independently. This is really important philosophic topic, because we considered minor things, and then our colleague shared with us that we should protect our borders concerning our state borders and even in the activity of our women's organizations. So we continue to remind about the challenges in the activity of women's organization. And I give the floor to Svitlana to continue and to speak about lives of women in Ukraine 30 years ago.
It's not easy for me to recollect something from early 1990s because at that time I was not part of the process. My story in this moment started since early year 2000, but as Tamara Marcinyuk mentioned in one of her articles, we tried all the sideways to reach our bright dream. And civil society organizations were searching and looking for their own identity and trying to identify the future role in the new society. What Larysa mentioned, that factors became the catalyzers in implementation of that dream, and that became the platform for the foundation of the female organizations. When the government of Ukraine for the first time recognized the gender policy as one of its objectives, it was an important moment for us, but it happened only in 2017, rather late, I mean, and before that, all the long period between the independence and 2017, we did our hard work trying to bring this the focus of the state policy. Before summarizing the achievements of the 30 years, I would like to point out to one important book or the expert with white font on the white page, something like that. And reading that book, I was very much impressed with the stories of women who started the female movement, and there was at that time there was a big distance between self-identification. I am a Ukrainian and I am a woman, and how the preference was made in comparison between these two identities, in choosing between the two identities. I'm a Ukrainian and I'm a woman. Well, it was almost impossible to bring together these two identities. Of course, we clearly sensed the big distance between these two self-identities, and many women put the self-identity, I am Ukrainian, first. Even today, many of us understand that actually these two aspects of self-identity, they do not conflict with each other, but they do not fully coincide at the same time. In this context, I would point out to the highlight of one article which was called I'm a Ukrainian, I'm lesbian, and I'm an Australian. So there's two opposite meanings, the opposition between these two self-identities. It was existent 30 years ago, and even today it continues to exist. For example, the UN Convention against violence on violence against women, quite often the supporters of this convention are blamed for the non-patriotic behavior, and they are blamed in counteraction to the traditional Ukrainian values without further discussion what those values are. And if we recollect the marches of Ukrainian women on the 8th of March and the slogans which were showed by the participants, that gender equality is a traditional inherited value of our society, and without this we cannot discuss the proper enjoyment of human rights. But when we discuss the human rights, when we quite often we sometimes exclude the female gender rights from that, and now you may find a new term, human female rights. Actually, this is a serious challenge to the human rights activists, to the civic activists in this country as a whole. Who would like to take the floor? When I recollect early 1990s, we clearly see that at that time people were very much preoccupied with the self-identification process. I clearly remember that when my students from Western Ukraine had come to the first lecture, and I entered the room and welcomed them in Ukrainian language. They started to applaud, because at that time even this small thing was a surprise for them. and at that time, when people tried to reject from the Soviet past, to turn their faces from the Soviet past, and demonstrated this in communication in Ukrainian language, etc. This was perceived as bravery. And today, when we point out to the colorful spectrum of social views at that time, and when we discuss this opposition between I am Ukrainian and I am a woman, women tried to balance this opposition in new presentation, how the old patriarchal traditions could be overcome by new genderly equal approach. And of course, old patriarchal traditions, even today, is reflected in a very active dialogue about the role of women in society. And even today, when we observe how show women in Afghan television had radically changed their appearance within one day, we start to understand that everything in human rights remains rather vulnerable, and when somebody wishes to sacrifice some interests, these are the female interests, gender equality interests, which easily are sacrificed in seriously dangerous societal situations. And this brings us to the clear idea that we have stand for the interests of gender equality, female gender equality, very strongly and very firmly even today. Well, this brings us to the next issue, the actual discussion about achievements within this 30 years. We had mentioned the problems and challenges which we had been facing during that 30 years, but today, let us also point out to our achievements. What were the victories? What were the wins which we could mention? I am a lawyer by background and working as an ombudsman as to the equality policy, and I'm inclined to discuss the legislative framework related to gender equality. And I have to say that during that 30 years, we gradually have joined almost all the international treaties as to gender equality. And here I have to remind you that the Convention on the Women's Equality was signed by Ukraine even in Soviet period. And we have joined a lot of treaties of the United Nations, the Council of Europe, and then later on cooperation with OSCE, NATO, etc., resulted for us in recognition of the gender equality issues. And back in 1986, the Verkhovna Rada discussed possibility to pass the law anti-discrimination of women. And in mid-1990s, it was passed. In the year 2002, a law on the violence in households, domestic violence, was passed. At that time, that law was faced a lot of opposition from the traditionalists, so to say. We also recollect about the law about counteraction to discrimination, which sets the provisions against gender discrimination, also contributes to this general idea about equality. And all those moves were initiated by female organizations. They were main engines, main pushers of those political changes that were made at the legislative level.
Thank you very much. For me, I believe that I'm a happy person. I haven't faced this gender discrimination, but experience is a good teacher. And I would like to speak about the achievements. And I worked in VIII convocation, and I would like to speak about the contribution of others. For me, this was a challenge and a big victory. Today, there was a presentation of the Fund of Democratic Initiatives, and they carried out a survey to mark the 30th anniversary of independence, and Ukrainians provide their answers about what was done. And first, me as a person who worked in politics and political parties, for me it was an important issue to adopt gender quotas in elections. This was a breakthrough that allowed to provide more equality at a local level, and also this was done for the national level, and this moved us forward to European values for many years ahead. And next, these were the laws concerning domestic violence. They provided basis for ratification of the Istanbul Convention. Unfortunately, VIII convocation was not able to do this. I'm sure that this story will be successfully resolved this year, and equal opportunities of this convocation and our government and the president, they promised this, and this will be a big victory. I may name other documents that were adopted in times of independence, you know, that economic gap and the salary gap remains 24-25%. And also prohibited professions for women, and the list of these professions was cancelled, and women now may get proper access to professions with high salaries, and they will be financially independent throughout their lives, and also during pension, because pensions depend on salaries. A lot has been done after the Maidan period, and this period of Russian aggression. During this period, a number of laws was approved to highlight the issues concerning women who serve in the army. Previously, they were only cooks and doctors, and they didn't get military ranks and proper salaries and promotion. And now we may be proud of 3 generals, women generals. We may be proud of them. In 2004 and in 2010, we had this, and these were the breakthroughs during independence. And the main, I believe, the main victory, I said about this, that 2017, the government had the task to provide for equal rights for men and women, and vice premier position was introduced, and he carried out this policy. And also the position of ombudsman on gender equality. This position was introduced for the first time in the history of Ukraine to form this policy and to support it and to continue it. As Larysa said, this is really one vulnerable issue. When we are speaking about gender stereotypes, they remain. I remember convocation in the parliament and the labor code voting, and these were laughs and heated discussions. People couldn't properly understand what was going on. One of the issues I would like to raise, how to fight it. And this is my dream and my work. Strategy of education and gender topics awareness. Unfortunately, we haven't provided this document to form consciousness of our youth and to improve understanding of other groups of people concerning opportunities. We hope that this will be adopted soon. We'll speak about our plans for the future, but now we will speak about the results, about vulnerability, about fragility. During all these 30 years, if we're speaking about policy concerning equality between men and women, this was the most fragile segment of the policy. And this was inherited by the governments. We had many governments, and this institutional memory and its preservation concerning general topics, this was important and difficult question. And Women's organizations promoted these issues, and civil society activists also provided for this. It was supported by international organizations and projects, and this had a positive role. But of course, we need people, personalities who promote all these topics. And also about contribution of women's organizations and the results that were mentioned. The majority of the initiatives that later on were implemented in laws, in regulations, strategies, and the planning. These were initiated by the communities and centers. And NGOs initiated them. They provided slogans 50-50, men and women in the parliament, and they demanded this quota. And parliamentarians felt their responsibility at a higher level, and they provided other response to the demands of NGOs. Also, civil activists joined LGBT marches and also protected equality. And on the 8th of March, we thought, what would be our main slogan? This idea appeared as a response to those who spoke about traditional values. They couldn't formulate what are these traditional values that they want to protect. We clearly understand why equality is our value and why it is traditional, because it is in Ukrainian people DNA and in DNA of Ukrainian women. When we spoke about this, about different issues, about institutional mechanisms of provision of gender equality. In this way, we handed over to the power not only the content, not only this, but also this energy of society that is ready to live in accordance with other rules in new conditions, with new distribution of roles, and with new understanding of human rights and women's rights. Not going into the list of these achievements and in many media and during many events, these lists, they are extended. I would like to say that civil society really contributed to these results. Thank you, and Olena may continue. Thank you, Iryna. Answering your question, I would like to say and address those who asked during trainings and other events. Olena, how will this gender issue influences old women in the villages? Jokes aside, I would like to speak about 3 results that we can identify. First, gender policy today is using the instruments that bring practical results for people. Infrastructure improvement in different settlements, and also what my colleagues mentioned about legal acts and other aspects of state policy. It leads to second result. We had small number of models that we were able to use 30 years ago, and today these instruments I've mentioned, they provided the opportunity to have many sectors, defense and security, diplomatic positions. They are open for those who want to work on these positions. And women got opportunities. They now understand who provided these beneficial things to them. Women came to me and they thanked me, and I asked them why they thanked me. First time a woman got a position in the sector of security and defense, and she told me that due to you now I am able to work on this position. And I believe this is really why we change our legislation and participate in actions and move forward. And we have still a lot of work ahead of us. Yeah, we have a lot of work, and it brings us to our last question. And we have been speaking for an hour, and time flies so fast when we are speaking about important topics such as gender issues and the results of women's organizations during these 30 years. And now about our plans for the future. For example, in my plan for 2040, this is 50th year of independence. For example, in 30 years, what would you like to have as a result during these 20 years? And for example, what do you want to have as a result of your work in 20 years? In Sweden, 20 years ago, we met with a group of small children, and we asked them about the number of women that should work in the parliament, and they didn't understand this question. And I wish that in 20 years, people would not understand who should work in the parliament and who should take the leave to care for their children, or who should be top commanders in the military. I want that in 20 years, everything we form now as a problem would be resolved, of course. And it should be so invisible and daily things. People, I hope, will not think about it because they would enjoy their rights. And when these rights are enjoyed and satisfied, people do not speak about these issues because they become invisible, and they do not irritate. They are not thought about. But a lot, we should do really a lot in order to achieve this. Maybe someone wants to share their dreams, Kateryna. I would like that in 20 years that Crimea and Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts return to Ukraine, and of course we want to have it sooner than this. And about my expectations, I believe that we will continue to discuss these topics in 20 years. Those trends in the world and the reinforcement of radicalism and religious fundamentalism and this attack on rights and freedoms. This goes not only from Russia, but also from other groups and countries. And I believe that in 20 years, we will have this active work. It is difficult to reach some success in provision of gender equality and the rights of women, but it is even more difficult to preserve them, to support them, and to move forward. That's why I believe that in 20 years, we will be able, I hope we will be able to meet in this composition, and they will say that here we have not only mothers of Ukrainian women's movement, but even grandmothers of this movement. And we will still speak about these principles that were formulated at the Beijing platform. And now the experts of international organizations, they say that those tasks that were put 26 years ago, they are not completed. There are a lot of obstacles, a lot of going back, and we still have a lot to learn how to convince people. And Svitlana Mikhailovna, at the national plan, and in VIII, we have the strategy of gender equality in education, and the Ministry of Education and Science, they have such a task. Now they develop national strategy of gender equality that includes all spheres. And I believe, and I am one of the initiators of this work, provides a simple answer to this question. Gender equality is about every area. It relates to everyone. And I hope that Ukraine will be able to ratify the Istanbul Convention at the first stage of the next 20 years, and will be able to form this nonviolent society to provide happiness to all people and families and Ukraine as a whole. And we hope that Ukraine will be an active player in the world agenda. I really like your ideas. Please, Svitlana, continue. First, I would like to see Ukraine as a member of NATO and the European Union. These are my values. I believe that our children and grandchildren, they should be in the civilized world. And as a well-informed pessimist, I believe that these values, these opportunities of equality, they should not be an exception. They should become our daily life. And this is the main in my dreams. Then we will form another life, another approaches in economy, in politics, in other spheres of life. Thank you. And in the conditions of sustainable peace, we meet and we speak about how we successfully overcame hybrid threats that were the biggest barriers to this sustainable peace, and what role was belonged to women, and that it is really important to remember that if we have a good situation, it may really change and be different. And we hope that in 20 years, we would speak about good situation while celebrating the Independence Day, the 50th anniversary. And I would like also hope to have this goals that will be implemented, and I hope that we were able to speak about Ukrainian movements, and we spoke about this issue on the eve of the 30th anniversary of independence of Ukraine, and we thank Elena Suslova, Levchenko, and others, and we thank everyone who joined us, and we thank you for this opportunity to speak. And this event was supported by the National the Institute of Regional Press and a company against sexism in the media. And we thank you all, and we hope that we will be able to meet with you later on to discuss about results that we will have in the future.